the beautiful heiress and her 6 sisters. What happens when a man falls for the most beautiful woman in the valley only to discover she comes with 6 sisters who refuse to let any suitor near her? The winter wind carried secrets across the Montana territory, and Clay Whitmore had learned to listen to every whisper it brought. Standing on his front porch, steam rising from his morning coffee, he watched the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink. The sight never grew old, but today something felt different. Today, the wind seemed to be telling him that change was coming to the valley. Clay had inherited his ranch from his grandfather 3 years ago, along with the old man's debts and a stubborn streak that ran deeper than the valley's frozen streams. At 28 he had calloused hands, a weathered face, and a reputation for being as reliable as the sunrise. What he didn't have was a wife, though not for lack of trying. The few eligible women in their small community had either married young or moved east to the cities, seeking lives their fathers' homesteads couldn't provide. The neighboring spread, the Clearwater Ranch, had been empty for as long as Clay could remember. Old Henry Clearwater had died childless years ago, and the property had fallen into the hands of distant relatives back east. Clay had grown used to the silence from across the creek, the empty windows of the grand house that overlooked the valley like a sleeping giant. But this morning, as he sipped his coffee and planned his day, Clay noticed something that made him set down his cup with a soft clink. Smoke was rising from the Clearwater chimney, not the thin, hesitant smoke of a caretaker's fire, but the thick, confident plume of a family settling in for winter. Clay's horse, Thunder, snorted impatiently from the corral, as if sensing his master's sudden restlessness. The big bay gelding had been Clay's companion through 3 hard winters, and together they had turned the Whitmore ranch from a struggling operation into something that could support a family if Clay could ever find someone willing to share the isolation and hard work that came with ranching life. As the morning wore on, Clay found himself glancing toward the Clearwater house more often than he cared to admit. By noon, curiosity had gotten the better of him. He saddled Thunder and rode out to check his fence line, the one that happened to run closest to the Clearwater property. What he saw there made him rein in his horse so suddenly that Thunder danced sideways in protest. A young woman stood in the Clearwater garden, her breath creating small clouds in the crisp air as she hung washing on a line that stretched between 2 bare apple trees. She wore a simple blue dress with a cream-colored shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her long auburn hair caught the afternoon light like spun copper. Even from a distance, Clay could see that she moved with an easy grace that spoke of strength rather than delicacy. But what truly caught his attention was the scene unfolding around her. 6 other young women bustled about the yard, some carrying baskets of vegetables from what must have been a root cellar, others tending to a small herd of chickens that pecked at the ground near the barn. Their voices carried across the creek on the cold air, a mixture of laughter and gentle bickering that spoke of sisters who had learned to work together through necessity. Clay counted them twice to be sure. 7 women, ranging in age from what looked like 16 to perhaps 30, 7 sisters, if his eyes didn't deceive him. The auburn-haired woman seemed to be the oldest, directing the others with quiet authority while still doing her share of the work. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up from the washing line and across the creek. Their eyes met for a moment that seemed to stretch like the valley itself, and Clay felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun. She had the kind of face that artists might try to capture but never quite manage. Intelligent eyes, a determined chin, and a smile that appeared as she noticed him watching. She raised one hand in a friendly wave, and Clay found himself touching the brim of his hat in response before he quite realized what he was doing. Then one of her sisters called to her, and the moment broke. She turned back to her work, but not before Clay caught another glimpse of that smile. Thunder shifted restlessly beneath him, and Clay realized he had been sitting motionless for several minutes. With a final glance toward the Clearwater house, he guided his horse back toward his own property, his mind already racing with possibilities. That evening, as he sat by his fireplace with a book he couldn't quite focus on, Clay made a decision. Tomorrow he would ride over to the Clearwater ranch and introduce himself properly. It was the neighborly thing to do, after all. The fact that he hadn't been able to get the auburn-haired woman's smile out of his mind was surely just coincidence. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of sharp blue sky that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Clay took extra care with his appearance, choosing his newest shirt and making sure his beard was neatly trimmed. He saddled Thunder with hands that were steadier than his heartbeat and rode across the creek that separated the 2 properties. The Clearwater ranch looked different up close. Someone had been working hard to restore, if the porch had been swept clean. New shutters painted a cheerful green, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Clay could hear voices from inside the house, the same blend of conversation and laughter he had noticed the day before. He was still trying to work up the courage to knock when the door opened, and the auburn-haired woman appeared. She was even more beautiful up close, with green eyes that held both warmth and sharp intelligence. "You must be our neighbor," she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent that marked her as an outsider but somehow made her even more intriguing. "I saw you watching from across the creek yesterday." Clay felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Clay Whitmore. I own the ranch just across the way. I wanted to come by and welcome you to the valley." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Whitmore. I'm Evangeline Clearwater, and this was my great-uncle's property. We've come west to ... double quotes." She paused, as if considering how much to share. "Well, to start fresh, I suppose you could say," before Clay could respond. The door opened wider, and he found himself face to face with not one, but all 7 of the Clearwater sisters. They arranged themselves behind Evangeline like a protective wall, each one studying him with varying degrees of curiosity and suspicion. "These are my sisters," Evangeline said, and Clay heard a note of resigned amusement in her voice. "Miranda, Cordelia, Beatrice, Ophelia, Portia, and Rosalind." She gestured to each in turn, and Clay tried to keep track of names while noting that the youngest looked to be about 16 and the others ranged upward from there. "Pleasure to meet you all, ladies," Clay managed, touching his hat brim again. The sisters murmured polite responses, but he noticed that none of them moved away from the doorway. If anything, they seemed to close ranks more tightly around Evangeline. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Whitmore?" Evangeline asked. "We were just having our morning break." "That would be much appreciated, Miss Clearwater." But as Evangeline moved to step aside and invite him in, one of her sisters, Miranda, he thought, cleared her throat meaningfully. Evangeline paused, and Clay saw a complex exchange of glances pass between the 7 women. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make him feel like an outsider looking in on a conversation conducted in a language he didn't understand. "Perhaps," Evangeline said carefully, "we could sit on the porch instead. The weather is quite pleasant for November." Clay agreed, though he couldn't help noticing how all 6 sisters found reasons to join them on the porch, arranging themselves in chairs and on the porch rail like sentinels. The conversation that followed was pleasant but stilted, with Evangeline telling him about their journey from Philadelphia and their plans to restore the ranch, while her sisters interjected with comments and questions that seemed designed to keep Clay from getting too comfortable. It wasn't until he was riding home an hour later that Clay began to understand what he was up against. The Clearwater sisters weren't just protective of Evangeline, they were suspicious of any man who showed interest in her, and from the way they had watched his every move and monitored every word of their conversation, he suspected this wasn't the first time they had closed ranks against a potential suitor. Over the following weeks, Clay found excuses to visit the Clearwater ranch regularly. He brought over tools they might need, offered to help with repairs, and even invited them all to Sunday dinner at his place. Each time he was received politely, but with the same careful watchfulness from Evangeline's sisters. Slowly, he began to piece together their story. The Clearwater sisters had been raised by a father who died young and a mother who had taught them to rely on each other above all else. When their mother passed away the previous spring, they had discovered that their father's debts were larger than his estate. Rather than see the family broken up, with some sisters married off to pay the debts and others sent to work as governesses or seamstresses, Evangeline had convinced them all to come west and claim their great-uncle's property. "We stick together," Portia, one of the middle sisters, told him one afternoon when he had stopped by to help repair a section of their barn roof. "Always have, always will. Evie's the one who kept us all together when Mama died, and we're not about to let some sweet-talking man come along and take her away from us." Clay paused in his hammering, considering her words. What if the man didn't want to take her away? What if you wanted to become part of your family instead? Portia gave him a sharp look. "Men don't work that way, Mr. Whitmore. They take what they want and move on. We've seen it happen before." That evening, as Clay groomed Thunder in his barn, he thought about Portia's words and the defensive way all the sisters watched over Evangeline. He was beginning to understand that their protectiveness came from experience and fear. They had already lost their parents and nearly lost each other. The idea of losing Evangeline to marriage must feel like another threat to the family they had fought so hard to keep together. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing snowstorms that swept across the valley like white curtains. Clay found himself worrying about the Clearwater sisters, alone in their big house with winter closing in around them. When a particularly fierce blizzard hit just before Christmas, he couldn't resist saddling Thunder and riding over to check on them. Despite the howling wind and driving snow, he found the sisters huddled in their kitchen, the only room they could keep warm with their limited supply of firewood. The chimney in the main parlor had been damaged by the wind, and without it, most of the house was too cold to inhabit. "This is foolish," Clay said, looking around at the 7 women wrapped in quilts and shawls. "You can't stay here like this. Pack what you need and come back to my place until the storm passes." For a moment, he thought they would refuse. The sisters exchanged their complex series of glances, and he could see the internal debate playing out across their faces. Pride warred with practicality, independence with a simple need for warmth and safety. It was Evangeline who finally spoke. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Whitmore, but we couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Clay interrupted. "It's what neighbors do for each other. Besides, my house is plenty big, and I've got more firewood than I can use all winter." The blizzard made the decision for them. As if to underscore Clay's point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the kitchen windows and sent a shower of snow down the damaged chimney. Within an hour, all 7 sisters were bundled into Clay's wagon, their essential belongings packed around them like refugees fleeing a disaster. Clay's house had never felt so full of life. The sisters transformed it from a bachelor's quiet refuge into something that hummed with conversation and activity. They cooked elaborate meals together, played card games by the fire, and filled the rooms with laughter and the kind of gentle bickering that only came from people who had learned to love each other despite their differences. And for the first time since he had met them, Clay began to see the sisters as individuals rather than a protective wall around Evangeline. Miranda, the second eldest, had a dry wit and a talent for organizing that rivaled a military commander. Cordelia loved to read and could discuss literature with an intelligence that impressed him. Beatrice had a gift for making people laugh, while Ophelia possessed a quiet wisdom that seemed older than her years. Portia was the practical one, always finding solutions to problems. And Rosalind, the youngest, had an artist's eye for beauty in unexpected places. But it was during the quiet moments, when the others were busy elsewhere, that Clay began to truly know Evangeline. She would sit with him by the fire after her sisters had gone to bed, and they would talk about everything and nothing, their childhood dreams, their fears for the future, the way the valley looked under starlight. "They think I don't know what they're doing," Evangeline said one evening, glancing toward the stairs where her sisters had strategically retired early, leaving the 2 of them